The February air in Corktown, Detroit, cut through Evelyn Carter's lungs like tiny shards of glass. Iron-tinged wind swept off the river, carrying the scent of industrial decay that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. She pushed against the corrugated door of O'Hara's garage, and the hinges protested with a screech that echoed through the empty street. Her Uncle Ray's final gift to her, this crumbling building filled with what most would call junk. Inside, the cold settled heavier, a physical weight on her shoulders. The garage smelled of decades-old oil spills, damp cardboard boxes that had survived countless Michigan winters, and the unmistakable mustiness of mouse nests tucked into forgotten corners. A solitary beam of winter light slipped under the door, illuminating piles of twisted mufflers and dented fenders that resembled a frozen metal tide. Quite the inheritance, she whispered to herself, her breath forming small clouds that dissipated into the stillness. The sound of expensive boots on concrete made her turn. Ron Pike stood there, his presence filling the space before his voice did. The self-proclaimed scrap king of Jefferson Avenue wore a coat too fine for this neighborhood, cologne too sharp for this room. His smile never reached the cold calculation in his eyes. "Bad break, sweetheart," he said, tapping a yellowed stack of papers on the counter. Bills, notices, demands for payment, their edges curled and greasy from years of being pushed aside. "I'll do you a favor. $2,000 to haul all this garbage away. Today." Evelyn pulled her worn coat tighter, fingers finding the familiar tear in the left pocket she'd been meaning to fix for months. Outside, she heard the distant rhythmic clack of the people mover, and somewhere in the garage, the slow, patient tick of a cooling engine. "It's not garbage," she managed, the words falling between them like pebbles. Ron chuckled, the sound rich with condescension. "Single mom, right? $2,000 keeps your lights on a week longer. Be wise." He let the number hang between them, a poorly disguised hook baited with desperation. Before Evelyn could respond, the side door creaked open. Naomi, 13 years old with a constellation of freckles across her nose and winter-chapped lips, slipped in beside her mother. Without a word, she took Evelyn's hand, small fingers interlacing with hers as if to anchor them both against the tide of Ron Pike's assumptions. Evelyn felt the familiar ache rise in her chest, the same one that appeared whenever someone looked at her as if she were a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected. Lost shifts at the diner, rent checks that barely made it in time. The countless small humiliations that arrived dressed as well-meaning advice. "This place has history," Evelyn said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. "My uncle wouldn't have left it to me if it was worthless." Ron's smile tightened at the edges. "History doesn't pay property taxes, honey. Clock's ticking on this place." He flicked a business card onto the counter. It landed face up on the oil-black wood, stark white against decades of grime. "Call me when reality sinks in." He left with the confident stride of a man accustomed to getting his way, the door slamming behind him with a finality that reverberated through the metal walls. What remained was a room full of cold metal and a silence thick enough to breathe, heavy with an indignation that stuck to Evelyn's tongue like rust. "Mom?" Naomi's voice was small but clear. "He's wrong, isn't he?" Evelyn squeezed her daughter's hand, noticing how Naomi's knuckles were red from the cold she pretended not to feel. "About most things, yes." They walked deeper into the garage, their footsteps echoing against concrete and metal. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with coffee cans filled with bolts, washers, and parts Evelyn couldn't name. Workbenches cluttered with tools stood like silent sentinels. In the back corner, shapes draped with canvas tarps loomed like sleeping giants. "Uncle Ray knew engines better than people," Evelyn said, running her fingers along a workbench. "He could hear a car from blocks away and tell you what was wrong with it before it even pulled in." Naomi moved toward one of the tarps, hand outstretched. "Not yet," Evelyn said gently. "We need to figure out what we're dealing with first." The weight of the situation settled on her shoulders. The garage was just one more responsibility, one more burden to carry alongside hospital cleaning shifts that left her hands raw from bleach, alongside the bus rides that took forever through slush-covered streets, alongside the whispers at church when she slipped in late with Naomi in tow. Yet something in the air here, beneath the dust and cold, whispered of possibility. Uncle Ray had been eccentric but never foolish. There was a reason he'd held on to this place until his dying breath. A reason he'd specified it go to her in his will. "We could come back tomorrow," Naomi suggested, breath clouding before her. "Bring flashlights. Maybe start organizing things." Evelyn nodded, her gaze traveling across the vast space that now belonged to her. Outside, day was already fading, the weak winter sun surrendering to an early dusk. They needed to catch the bus back to their apartment before dark. As they locked up, Evelyn's hand found the metal key fob in her pocket. The winged wheel from old Motor City days, cracked along one wing. Her father's last gift before he died. "For luck," he had said. She looked at the corrugated door of O'Hara's garage, at the faded sign above it, at the city skyline beyond. The broken key seemed to warm slightly in her palm, as if awakening after a long sleep. "Tomorrow," she said to Naomi, to the garage, to herself. "We'll come back tomorrow." Evelyn once imagined a different life, one where coffee came in porcelain cups instead of styrofoam, where weekends weren't consumed by double shifts at the hospital where she cleaned floors nights, where the porch of a house that belonged to her wasn't buckling under layers of peeling paint. Instead, her days unfolded as a series of quiet wars. Marcus walking out when Naomi was still in diapers, claiming fatherhood was more than he signed up for. Layoffs at the diner where she'd memorized every regular's order. Bus routes that stretched into eternity through Detroit's winter slush. She'd learned to count quarters by feel in the darkness of her pocket, to pretend she didn't hear the whispers when she slipped into church late, Naomi's hand in hers and exhaustion etched beneath her eyes. Life had become a collection of small indignities she weathered with a straightened spine and a smile that cost her more than anyone knew. The morning after their first visit to the garage, Evelyn woke before her alarm. The apartment was cold, the heating system temperamental at best, and she could hear Naomi's soft breathing from the fold-out couch in their one-bedroom unit. Outside, Detroit was still dark, streetlights casting amber pools on snow that had fallen overnight. She reached for the metal key fob on her nightstand, the one her father had pressed into her palm the night before he died. The Motor City's wings, he'd called it, his voice already fading. "For luck, Evie." The metal had cracked along one wing that same night, as if marking his passing. The split looked like a fissure through hope itself. Yet she still rubbed the cold metal when she couldn't sleep, feeling its broken line as if to trace a map back to the person she used to be. In the kitchen, she made coffee in silence, watching steam rise from the mug, like ghostly fingers reaching for the ceiling. Bills were stacked neatly on the counter, electricity due in 3 days, rent in 5. The numbers danced before her eyes, a familiar choreography of not enough. "Mom?" Naomi appeared in the doorway, hair wild from sleep, her 2 small pajamas revealing bony wrists. "You're up early." "Just thinking about the garage," Evelyn said, pouring a glass of milk for her daughter. Naomi took the milk and leaned against the counter. At 13, she was already showing glimpses of the woman she would become. Thoughtful, observant, with a quiet strength that reminded Evelyn of her own mother. "We could sell some stuff online," Naomi suggested. "I could take pictures on my phone." Despite everything, Naomi was the one who made the weight lighter. On hard nights, when bill anxiety kept Evelyn awake, the girl would warm milk dusted with cinnamon and carry it to her mother's bed, the steam smelling like promise. On weekends, they walked downtown and pretended they owned the Guardian building with its orange glow. "Someday," Naomi would whisper, voice full of stubborn sunshine. "Your Uncle Ray taught me to change oil when I was 16, Evelyn said, watching morning light slowly fill their small kitchen. "He said I had patient hands." Naomi smiled, like surgeon hands. "Hospital cleaner hands," Evelyn corrected gently, showing her palms, reddened from industrial disinfectant and hot water. They took the early bus to Corktown, the city stirring around them. Fresh snow made even the abandoned buildings look dignified, like elderly women in white lace. The garage seemed different in morning light, less haunted, more like something waiting. Inside, their breath clouded before them like thoughts made visible. The cold had teeth, biting through gloves and sleeves. Naomi pointed to a shelf stacked with coffee cans, each one rattling with metal parts. "We could organize it," she said, her voice echoing against the high ceiling. "Sort the bolts and nuts and stuff. Sell the better parts online?" She turned to Evelyn, eyes bright with determination. "You always say good comes from patient hands." Evelyn smiled at her child's faith. Outside, a bus sighed to a stop, and salsa rhythms floated in from the bodega on Porter Street. The music seemed to wake something in the building, or in Evelyn herself. She tucked the broken key into her glove and nodded, feeling, for the first time in a long time, the shy stir of possibility beneath the familiar ache. They worked through the morning, sorting parts into piles, uncovering workbenches buried under years of accumulated clutter. When Evelyn wiped dust from an old radio and managed to coax it to life, static gave way to Motown classics that filled the space with warmth. They danced as they worked, Naomi spinning between shelves, Evelyn remembering what it felt like to move without the weight of worry. By afternoon, they'd cleared a path to the back corner where the canvas-covered shape stood. Evelyn approached slowly, uncertainty pulling at her steps. Uncle Ray had been a mechanic, not a collector. What could be under these tarps that he'd kept hidden away? Her phone rang, the hospital number flashing on the screen. Another shift picked up. Another night of mopping hallways while Naomi did homework alone. The world rushing back in. "I have to take this," she said to Naomi, who nodded in understanding too profound for a child. That night, as Evelyn scrubbed hospital floors that never stayed clean, her mind kept returning to the garage, to the covered shapes in the back corner, to Uncle Ray's hands teaching her to change spark plugs, his voice gruff but patient. "Cars are simpler than people," he'd told her. "They tell you exactly what's wrong if you know how to listen." When she got home after midnight, she found Naomi asleep with a notebook open beside her. Inside were sketches of the garage transformed, organized shelves, clean workbenches, a sign that read Carter and O'Hara Auto in careful letters. In the margins, Naomi had written calculations. Parts sorted. Approximately value dollars chag, with spaces left blank, waiting for numbers to fill them. Evelyn sat on the edge of the fold-out couch, watching her daughter breathe, seeing in her face the same stubborn hope she herself had once possessed. The city hummed outside their window. Distant traffic, the occasional siren, the persistent pulse of a place that refused to die despite decades of obituaries written for it. She took out the broken key fob and turned it over in her palm. The crack seemed less like a wound now, more like a beginning. Something shifting in the universe, perhaps. A door unlocking somewhere. "Patient hands," she whispered to the darkness, an incantation against doubt. Tomorrow they would return to the garage. Tomorrow they would uncover what lay beneath those tarps. Tomorrow perhaps the luck her father had promised might finally find her. The city inspector came on a Tuesday when the sky hung over Detroit like a sheet of hammered lead. Evelyn had just finished organizing a shelf of spark plugs, her fingers numb despite the space heater she'd brought from home. The door swung open with a gust of wind that scattered her neat piles of receipts across the concrete floor. Miss Harrow stood in the doorway, clipboard clutched against a wool coat the exact color of a pencil lead. Her face was all angles and efficiency, her eyes sweeping the garage with the practiced assessment of someone who'd seen every violation in the book. "Evelyn Carter?" she asked, though it wasn't really a question. "Building inspection." Evelyn straightened, wiping greasy hands on her jeans. "We're in the middle of organizing," she began, gesturing to the progress they'd made over the past week. The swept floors, the labeled shelves, the workbench cleared for actual work. Miss Harrow's pen scratched against paper like a small animal digging for shelter. Unsafe storage conditions, probable vermin infestation, electrical hazards. Each observation clicked from her mouth with the finality of a closing door. Fire code violations in sections 3, 7, and 12. Naomi appeared from the back room where she'd been cataloging gaskets, her eyes wide at the intrusion. Evelyn placed a protective hand on her daughter's shoulder. "We inherited this place recently," Evelyn explained, hating the defensive note in her voice. My uncle passed away, and we're working on a 10 days to comply. Miss Harrow moved to the door, producing an orange notice from her clipboard. The staple gun she used to affix it to the wooden doorframe screamed into wood like a tiny mechanical banshee. The notice fluttered in the draft. 10 days to comply, the words pulsing like a headache. After the inspector left, Evelyn and Naomi stood in silence, the orange paper between them like a countdown clock. What happens after 10 days? Naomi finally asked, her voice small in the vast space. Evelyn stared at the notice, mentally calculating costs she couldn't afford, repairs she didn't know how to make. Yes, she said softly. More than we have. The garage felt suddenly colder, the progress they had made, insignificant against the mountain of violations. Outside, Detroit continued its winter business. Buses groaning to stops, car horns punctuating conversations, the persistent scrape of snow shovels on sidewalks. Evelyn's phone buzzed with a text from her supervisor at the hospital. Could she cover an additional shift tonight? The extra hours would help, but leaving Naomi alone again twisted something in her chest. Go, Naomi said, reading her mother's hesitation. I'll keep working here until dinner time, then lock up. Naomi, I'm 13, Mom. I can get home on my own. She smiled, a flash of determination across her face. Besides, we only have 10 days. When Evelyn returned to the garage the next morning, exhaustion dragging at her limbs from the double shift, she found Ron Pike leaning against the counter. He flipped the orange compliance notice with one manicured finger, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Tick-tock, he murmured, looking around at their organizing efforts with calculated dismissal. After the deadline, fines compound daily. Your landlord hears about it. Maybe your lease jumps. He stepped closer, cologne overpowering the honest smells of oil and metal. You can't carry this, Evelyn. He said it lightly, like weather talk, a blizzard of inevitabilities that she should simply accept. His offer remained at $2,000, cash today, for everything in the garage, including the tools they'd spent a week sorting. After he left, Evelyn stood motionless in the center of the garage, the orange notice seeming to glow brighter against the fading daylight. That night, the heat in their apartment hiccuped and failed completely. Pipes clanged somewhere in the building like distant anvils. Evelyn stood in the kitchen with 2 unpaid bills fanned on the table, electricity and rent. The paper fibers rough under her fingertips. The room smelled of burnt toast and the lemon cleaner she used to hide the smell of worry. She pressed the broken key fob into her palm until it left a dent. God, she whispered, not as a sermon, but as a breath, a name spoken into darkness. Back at the garage the next morning, Evelyn sent Naomi to the far aisles with a flashlight to continue cataloging parts while she tried to address the most obvious safety violations. The cold had the sharpness of teeth, biting through layers despite the space heater's valiant efforts. Mom? Naomi's voice echoed from the back corner, breathless with discovery. Come here! Evelyn found her daughter kneeling next to a wall where shelving had been pushed aside. A stack of hubcaps lay scattered on the floor. The wall, Naomi said, tapping the brick surface with her knuckles. Listen. Evelyn knelt beside her daughter. Naomi knocked again, and the sound that returned wasn't the solid thunk of brick, but something hollow, something that resonated like an empty chest. They examined the wall more closely. Behind a hanging calendar from 1989, a curling photo of a Corvette cruising down Woodward Avenue, one brick looked slightly different from the others. The mortar around it was cracked, age turning it to powder. Naomi held the flashlight steady, creating a bright coin of light against the dark wall, and Evelyn felt a prickle run up her arms. In the stillness, the old building seemed to hold its breath. Beneath the smell of oil and dust, there was something else, a faint sweetness, like old paper, as if memory itself had a scent, and a secret ready to exhale. Should we? Naomi whispered, excitement vibrating in her voice. Evelyn nodded, reaching for a flathead screwdriver from her back pocket. She worked the tool into the crumbling mortar around the brick, the metal screeching softly against stone. The brick shifted, then came loose in her hands, revealing a black cavity behind it. Naomi gasped, leaning forward to shine the light into the hole. Metal gleamed back at them, the corner of what looked like a tin box. Evelyn reached in, her fingers brushing cold metal. The box was wedged tightly, but with careful maneuvering, she managed to work it free. It was heavier than she expected, the metal powdery with age and damp. They carried it to the workbench, setting it down with the reverence of archaeologists uncovering an artifact. Dust billowed as it touched down, dancing in the weak sunlight that filtered through grimy windows. The clasp was rusted shut, requiring another application of the screwdriver to pry it open. When the lid finally creaked back, a smell rose: dry paper, old glue, and the faintest whisper of tobacco, the scent of men telling stories under dangling shop bulbs. Naomi leaned so close her breath disturbed the contents, her eyes wide with wonder. "What is it?" she whispered. Evelyn's hands trembled as she reached into the box, past the initial layer of dust. Her fingers touched paper, folders tied with rotting twine, their edges softened by decades. Something shifted in her chest, a feeling like standing at the edge of a precipice, not knowing yet whether she would fall or fly. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the orange notice on the door like a warning. But inside, in this moment suspended between past and future, Evelyn felt something she hadn't in years: the warm, steady pulse of hope, beating alongside her heart. The tin box sat between them on the workbench, its contents catching the weak February light. Naomi's hands shook with excitement as she carefully lifted out the first folder, bound with twine that crumbled at her touch. Inside, sepia photographs slid against each other like autumn leaves, images frozen in time. She peeled one free, a group of men in coveralls standing proudly before a car with gleaming chrome and sweeping lines, their faces young and confident beneath oil-stained ka. "Look," Naomi breathed, passing it to her mother. "That's Uncle Ray." Evelyn recognized her uncle immediately, younger, with dark hairs, instead of the silver she remembered, but with the same stubborn set to his jaw. The photograph had been taken outside this very garage, though the street beyond looked different, fuller, alive with shops that had long since been boarded up. 1958, Evelyn read from the back of the photo, the ink faded but legible. She placed it carefully on the workbench and reached for another. This one showed a pre-war coupe with an Art Deco hood ornament that caught the light like a silver flame. The craftsmanship evident even in the grainy photograph made her breath catch. More photos emerged. Cars with names she recognized from her father's stories: Packard, Stutz, Auburn. Cars with graceful lines that had disappeared from American roads decades ago. Some photos had notes scribbled on the back. Custom order for Whitmore. Restoration completed March 1962. 1 of 7 built. Beneath the photographs lay envelopes marked with dates and stamped titles, their corners soft with age. The ink had faded to ghost blue, but the careful handwriting remained clear. Raymond O'Hara's distinctive script, with its precise angles and flourishes. At the bottom of the box rested a leather-bound ledger, its edges gone fuzzy with time and damp. Evelyn lifted it with reverent hands, the leather warm and alive beneath her touch. When she opened it, the spine crackled in protest, releasing the scent of old paper and tobacco. "What is it?" Naomi asked, leaning close, her breath warm against Evelyn's cheek. Page after page of neat script filled the ledger. Entries dating back to the early 1950s, each one meticulously recorded in Raymond O'Hara's hand. Chassis numbers, custom orders, appraisals. Some entries bore asterisks and cryptic notations. One off, prototype, coach built. Next to certain makes were appraisal values that made Evelyn blink. Figures with more zeros than she had ever seen next to her name. "Kaspabaya," Evelyn whispered. Uncle Ray was restoring classic cars. She turned the pages carefully, tracking the history of O'Hara's garage through vehicles that had passed through its doors. Some entries noted sold to collector or returned to owner, but others were marked retained or storage. Toward the back of the ledger, on a page dated just 3 years earlier, Evelyn found a note in handwriting that had grown shakier with age. Eyes. Cars stored for safekeeping during illness. "For Evelyn, if I don't make it, She listens like an honest wrench. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. Uncle Ray, gruff and solitary, had left her more than a building full of scrap. He'd left her a legacy. "Mom," Naomi said, tugging at her sleeve, "there's more." The girl stood by the back wall where they'd found the box, flashlight beam trained on the far corner of the garage. There, beneath dust-covered tarps that slumped like sleeping giants, lay the outlines of several vehicles. They'd noticed them before, but assumed they were just more piles of parts. Evelyn moved toward them slowly, heart hammering against her ribs. The concrete floor was cold beneath her knees as she knelt beside the nearest shape and gripped the edge of the tarp. The fabric rasped under her palms, a heavy sigh, and then a gleam of polished metal appeared, catching the light like frost in sunlight. She pulled the tarp away completely, unveiling what lay beneath. Chrome winked in the dim light, headlights like eyes opening after a long sleep. A hood stretched long and elegant, curves flowing like water frozen in time. Spoked wheels with white wall tires. A wood-rimmed steering wheel visible through windows so clean they might have been polished yesterday. "It's beautiful," Naomi whispered, reaching out to touch the fender, then pulling back as if afraid it might disappear. The smell of old leather bloomed in the air, warm and rich, the scent of road trips someone had once promised themselves, of destinations never reached. Evelyn consulted the ledger, finding the entry that matched the vehicle before them, a 1938 touring car with a custom grille, commissioned for a Detroit industry magnate who had died before taking delivery. Appraisal value, enough to pay off their debts and then some. With trembling hands, she pulled away the second tarp, revealing a fastback with racing stripes asleep beneath years of careful storage. The third tarp hid a hand-built coupe with a coach builder's signature etched into the door sill, barely visible beneath decades of care. "They're not junk," Naomi said, laughter bubbling up in her voice, clean and bright as a bell. "They're history," Evelyn finished, something loosening in her chest, something that had been tight for so long she'd forgotten how it felt to breathe without it. "They're Detroit's history." She closed the ledger, tucking it under her arm, its weight firm and undeniable against her side. The orange notice still fluttered on the door, but it seemed less threatening now, less final. Outside, the wind dropped suddenly, as if the city itself was pausing to listen. Inside, the building finally exhaled a long-held breath. "What do we do now?" Naomi asked, her eyes reflecting the chrome before them. Evelyn looked at her daughter, at the hope blooming across her face like spring's first flowers, at the determination in her stance that mirrored Evelyn's own. She thought of Ron Pike and his dismissive offer, of Ms. Harrow and her clipboard of violations, of all the people who had looked at her, at them, and seen only what they lacked. "Now, Tan," Evelyn said, her voice steadier than it had been in years. "We make a plan." That night, they spread the photographs across their kitchen table, the ledger open beside them. The apartment was still cold, but something warm had kindled between them. A flame of possibility that hadn't existed that morning. They worked late into the night, Naomi researching classic car values online, while Evelyn made lists of what needed to be done to bring the garage up to code. In her pocket, the broken key fob seemed to pulse with energy, as if whatever luck her father had promised was finally finding its way to her. Outside, Detroit slept under fresh snow, streetlights casting long shadows across white drifts. Inside, mother and daughter bent over their work, their shadows merging on the wall behind them, indistinguishable from each other in the shared purpose that bound them together. By morning, they had a plan. By morning, they were ready. Word traveled faster than the people mover through Corktown. By Friday morning, O'Hara's garage hummed with a vitality it hadn't known in decades. Evelyn had made a few strategic calls to the Detroit Classic Car Club, to a reporter from the neighborhood paper who'd done a piece on local businesses, to a lawyer whose card she'd found in Uncle Ray's desk drawer. The orange notice still hung on the door, but its power had somehow diminished with each passing hour. Mr. Salazar from the taqueria across the street brought over a thermos of coffee that steamed cinnamon and cloves into the air. He lingered, eyes widening as Evelyn showed him the photographs of cars his father might have seen, cruising Woodward Avenue in their prime. "My papa worked at the Packard plant," he said, running weathered fingers over an image of a gleaming sedan. "He would come home with stories of these beauties being born." Two retired line workers from the old Packard plant showed up mid-morning, their hats clutched in calloused hands. They moved through the garage with reverence, identifying parts that younger men had long forgotten the purpose of, telling stories of an industry that had once defined not just a city, but an American century. "That there's a Carter carburetor," one said, lifting a metal component from a shelf Evelyn had marked for possible scrap. "They don't make them anymore, but collectors would pay good money for one in this condition." Naomi followed them, notebook in hand, recording values and histories with the diligence of a scholar. Her cheeks were flushed with excitement, her eyes bright with purpose. Evelyn watched her daughter transform before her, no longer just a child to be protected, but a partner in this unexpected venture. By noon, the garage was filled with light and voices. Someone had brought donuts. Someone else had hung a banner made from an old drop cloth. O'Hara's legacy painted in careful letters. The cars remained covered, their unveiling planned for later, when everyone had gathered. Miss Harrow arrived at 1 o'clock, her wool coat exchanged for a puffy jacket, her hair tucked into a knitted beanie. She moved through the door with the same efficiency as before, but her face changed when she saw the transformed space. Where there had been chaos, there was now order. Tools hung on pegboards, parts sorted into labeled bins, floors swept clean of decades of dust. "Miss Carter," she said, clipboard held close to her chest like a shield, "I received a call about an update to the compliance situation." Before Evelyn could respond, Mr. Whitmore stepped forward, elderly but straight-backed with a bow tie that seemed anachronistic in the working-class neighborhood. The attorney had arrived an hour earlier, ledger in hand, his eyes widening when Evelyn showed him what lay beneath the tarps. "As Ms. Carter's legal representative," he said with quiet authority, "I can assure you that we are addressing all compliance issues as per city code." He handed Miss Harrow a folder containing permits, applications, and a schedule of improvements that stretched just to the edge of the deadline. Miss Harrow's eyes narrowed as she scanned the documents, but the fight seemed to drain from her posture. "This is comprehensive," she admitted. Evelyn smiled, not in triumph, but in relief. "We're not looking to cut corners, Ms. Harrow, this place matters to the neighborhood, to my family." The inspector nodded, a hint of respect crossing her features. She moved toward the back of the garage where a small crowd had gathered around the still-covered vehicles, curiosity drawing them like moths to flame. The door slammed open just as Evelyn was preparing to unveil the first car. Ron Pike strode in with the confidence of a man who had never been refused, two men in coveralls following at his heels. Outside, the rumble of diesel engines announced the presence of tow trucks, their hydraulic lifts already engaged. "Well, well, Vanessa," Ron said, surveying the crowd with calculated amusement. "Quite the neighborhood meeting." His eyes found Evelyn's across the space, cold as February steel. "Still playing garage, sweetheart?" The room quieted, conversations dropping to whispers, then to silence. Naomi appeared at Evelyn's side, chin lifted in defiance that mirrored her mother's. Ron moved to the center of the room, his boots leaving wet prints on the freshly swept concrete. He clapped slowly, the sound echoing off the metal walls. "Pretty toys," he said, gesturing to the covered shapes. "Still scrap without papers." Something shifted in Evelyn then, a tectonic plate moving beneath years of accommodation, of making herself small to fit other people's expectations. She stepped forward, the ledger held against her chest like armor. "Papers?" she said, her voice steady as torque. "Numbers match the frames. Appraisals, Uncle Ray's notes." She handed a folder to Miss Harrow, whose gloved fingers turned the pages with growing interest. And a letter from Whitmore and Pena, attorneys, confirming provenance and ownership. Ron's smile tightened at the corners. "Yeah, Day. But without restoration, these are just rusting hulks. The cost to bring them back would bankrupt you twice over." Naomi stepped forward, phone held up like evidence. I recorded your offer on Tuesday, Mr. Pike. The one where you called the cars garbage and told my mom she was lucky to get $2,000 for everything in here. Her voice didn't have cruelty in it. It had clarity. The unvarnished truth laid bare. Murmurs rolled through the crowd. One of the retired workers stepped forward, his face flushed with emotion. That there is a 30s straight 8 with original trim, he said, voice trembling as he pointed to the largest covered shape. It belongs in a museum, or with the right hands. He looked at Evelyn, nodding once. Patient hands. Ron's cheeks colored, the flush creeping up from his collar like rising mercury. You don't know the market, he snapped, losing composure for the first time. You'll drown in taxes and storage fees. Insurance alone will eat you alive. He turned to Evelyn, voice dropping to a confidential murmur meant to exclude the others. Be smart. Call me when reality hits. My offer stays open, for now. Evelyn stepped forward, palms open, chin high. She thought of all the times she had backed down, swallowed her words, made herself fit the narrow spaces others had deemed appropriate. She thought of Naomi watching, learning, growing into a woman who would face the same pressures, the same dismissals. I know dignity, she said, voice clear enough to reach every corner of the room. I know fair value. And I know we're not desperate today. She didn't spit the words like barbs. She laid them down like planks, firm and walkable, a path forward. The room went quiet in that holy way before applause. Then someone, Mr. Salazar perhaps, or one of the retired workers, began to clap. Others joined, the sound swelling like an engine catching at last. Strong, clean, inevitable. Ron backed toward the door, signaling his men to retreat. The tow trucks outside revved once in frustration, then fell silent. He paused at the threshold, face unreadable. Your uncle was a stubborn old fool, he said, but the words lacked conviction. You're cut from the same cloth. Thank you, Evelyn replied, and meant it. After he left, the garage seemed to expand, the air lighter, the light brighter. Miss Harrow approached Evelyn, clipboard tucked under her arm. You have 9 days, she said, but her tone had softened. I'll come back then. We'll be ready, Evelyn promised. Mr. Whitmore joined them, bow tie slightly askew with excitement. There's significant interest from the Detroit Historical Society, he said, and 3 private collectors have already reached out based on the provenance alone. Evelyn nodded, absorbing the information like rainfall after drought. She looked around the garage at the people who had come to witness, at Naomi, whose face shone with triumph, at the covered cars that represented not just vehicles but possibilities. It's time, she said, moving toward the largest tarp. Her fingers found the edge, gripping fabric that had protected history through years of neglect. With one smooth motion, she pulled it away, revealing gleaming chrome, curved fenders, a windshield that caught the light like a diamond. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cameras flashed. Naomi laughed, the sound bouncing off metal and concrete, returning as music. 6 weeks later, the office smelled of coffee and freshly oiled wood. Spring had come to Detroit with tentative warmth, coaxing crocuses through cracks in sidewalks and bringing longer light to days that had seemed eternal in their darkness. Evelyn sat at the desk that had once been her uncle's, now refinished and organized, with a computer that Naomi had insisted was essential for their new venture. On the wall hung a framed photograph of Uncle Ray, grinning beneath a crooked cap, wrench in hand, as he leaned against the fender of a car long since sold but never forgotten. Beside it, Evelyn had placed the first dollar earned by Carter and Daughter Garage, payment for an oil change she'd performed herself, her hands remembering the patient rhythm taught by those same hands in the photograph. The transformation had happened with a speed that still left her breathless when she thought about it. The coach-built coupe had gone to auction through Whitmore and Pena, fetching a sum that had cleared all debts and left enough to renovate both the garage and their apartment. The Detroit Historical Society had expressed interest in displaying the pre-war touring car on loan, with a plaque honoring Raymond O'Hara's contribution to preserving automotive heritage. The fastback remained in the garage, a gleaming promise on wheels, its engine recently brought back to life under Evelyn's careful ministrations. She'd decided to keep it. Some history deserved to stay where it could be touched, where it could remind them of what patient hands could accomplish. The door chimed, a new addition, and Naomi burst in with her after-school energy, backpack slung over one shoulder, a folder clutched in her arms. "Mom! I got an A on my business plan project." Miss Reynolds said it was the most detailed she'd ever seen from an 8th grader. Evelyn smiled, pride warming her chest. The project, a comprehensive plan for Carter and Daughter Garage, had consumed Naomi's evenings for weeks. While other students created hypothetical businesses selling cupcakes or dog-walking services, Naomi had documented their actual journey, complete with financial projections. That Mr. Whitmore himself had reviewed with impressed eyebrows. "That's wonderful, honey," Evelyn said, rising to hug her daughter. "I'm putting it up right next to Uncle Ray." Naomi beamed, then turned as the bell chimed again. 3 teenage girls from her school filed in, their nervous excitement visible in fidgeting hands and darting eyes. They were the first participants in Girls with Wrenches, the Saturday workshop Naomi had proposed as part of their community outreach. "You guys are early," Naomi said, immediately slipping into the role of assistant instructor. "We're setting up in the back bay. Mom's going to show us how to change brake pads today." Evelyn watched as her daughter led the girls through. The garage, no longer a dusty, forgotten place, but a clean, well-lit space where neighbors came to learn basic car maintenance, where teen apprentices learned the value of working with their hands, where community found solid ground in a city too often defined by what it had lost rather than what it was building. Saturday mornings now filled the garage with laughter and questions, with the smell of cocoa mingling with rubber and oil, with the sound of metal tools against metal parts, and urban percussion that felt like the city's heartbeat. Mr. Salazar brought over tacos at lunchtime. The retired Packard workers dropped by to tell stories that the younger generation recorded on phones, preserving oral history alongside mechanical skills. Even Miss Harrow had returned, this time in street clothes, a casserole dish in hand as a peace offering. She'd stood awkwardly by the door, cheeks pink with something that might have been embarrassment. "We inspectors sometimes forget what we're protecting," she'd said softly, eyes taking in the transformed space. "It's not just about codes. It's about this." She gestured to the garage, to the people within it, to the life that had returned to a building once marked for disposal. Ron Pike had driven by once, slowing as he passed. He'd looked through the open bay doors where Evelyn was teaching a group of neighbors how to check their oil, his face unreadable behind tinted windows. For a moment, he'd lingered at the threshold like a man outside his own childhood, then driven away without a word, leaving only exhaust that dissipated in spring air. The legal ownership of the garage had been finalized the previous week. The deed transferred to Evelyn's name, the paperwork filed with the city. The broken key fob, once a reminder of loss, now hung from the ignition of the fastback, its crack no longer a fissure through hope, but a mark of character of history carried forward. That evening, after the last customer had gone and Naomi had finished her homework at the counter, they sat together on the front step of the garage, 2 mugs of tea steaming against the cooling air. Down Porter Street, a saxophone floated from an open window, and the sunset brushed the city in tones of honey and amber. Naomi leaned her head against her mother's shoulder, a gesture that belonged to a younger child but felt right in this moment of quiet companionship. "Mom," she said, voice a whisper over the hissing traffic, "do you think people saw us before this? I mean, really saw us?" Evelyn considered the question, watching a gull tilt over the river, silver against deepening blue. She thought of all the years of invisibility, the polite dismissals, the assumptions, the way people had looked through rather than at them. She thought too of Mr. Salazar, who had extended credit at the taqueria on lean weeks, of the church ladies who had watched Naomi after school when shifts ran long, of neighbors who had seen them clearly enough to offer small kindnesses that had made survival possible. "The ones that mattered," she answered finally, "the ones with eyes worth meeting." Naomi nodded, satisfied with this truth. They sat in silence for a moment, like listening to the city's evening symphony. Distant sirens, car doors slamming, voices calling across streets, music drifting from open windows. The sounds of life continuing, of people making their way as best they could. "I've been thinking," Naomi said, sitting up straighter. "We should offer scholarships. For the Girls with Wrenches program. For kids who can't pay the materials fee." Evelyn smiled, recognizing in her daughter the same impulse that had led her to slip extra food to hungry patients at the hospital, to hold doors for strangers struggling with packages, to leave quarters in vending machines for the next person. The inheritance that mattered most had nothing to do with garages or cars. It lived in the heart that had learned early to see others clearly. "We absolutely should," she agreed. She wrapped an arm around Naomi and squeezed, the broken key fob cool against her palm in her pocket. No longer a reminder of what was lost, but a symbol of what had been found. Not just material security, but something more valuable. Purpose, community, the knowledge that their story mattered. "Listen," she said softly. "What?" Naomi asked, tilting her head. "The engine's starting," Evelyn replied, smiling. "The life we've been tuning all along." As darkness gathered around them, lights came on throughout the neighborhood, windows glowing like beacons, street lamps creating pools of safety. The neon sign they'd installed above the garage door, casting a blue-red glow across the sidewalk. Carter and Daughter Garage. The name written in light. Evelyn lifted her mug in a toast to the city, to her daughter, to the garage that had become not an inheritance of dust, but a foundation for future. She breathed in the cooling spring air, felt Naomi's warmth beside her, and spoke the truth that felt like home. Love and dignity are treasures no one can steal.